Why Japan lost to the United States, a war they could never win.
14. Imagine for a moment. It is 1941. You are a high-ranking Japanese general, standing in a dimly lit room in Tokyo. You are looking at a map, but more importantly, you are looking at the ledgers. You aren't blinded by fanaticism. You are a man of cold logic, and that logic is screaming at you. You know with absolute certainty one thing. The United States is a titan. They aren't just stronger than you. They are a force of nature. You look at their military budget, and then at yours. It's like comparing an ocean to a pond. Their navy has the potential to grow until it blots out the sun, while you are struggling to find the steel for a single hull. They are wealthier than you. While your people are rationing every grain of rice and every scrap of metal, the Americans are living in an era of unprecedented abundance. Their banks hold the world's gold, and their credit is infinite. You realize that in a war of attrition, you aren't just fighting soldiers, you're fighting a vault that never goes empty. And their industry? It's a monster. You've seen the reports from Detroit and Pittsburgh. Their factories aren't just larger, they are operating on a scale that defies your imagination. For every single plane your craftsmen meticulously build by hand, their assembly lines can spit out 10, 20, maybe 50. Their industrial output isn't just a multiple of yours, it is a different dimension of power entirely. You know that once that giant wakes up and shifts from making cars to making tanks, the sheer weight of their production will eventually crush anything in its path. Yet, despite all of this, despite the maps, the math, and the terrifying shadows of their smokestacks, you are about to pick up your brush and sign the order to attack. Your hand might tremble, but your mind is made up. You are standing on the edge of a precipice, staring at a superpower that could swallow your empire whole. So why? Why does a rational man, a seasoned strategist, choose to ignite a fuse that leads to a powder keg he knows he cannot survive? What is it like to feel the walls closing in so tightly that a suicidal leap forward feels like the only way to breathe? Why choose to fight a war that the numbers say is already lost before the first shot is even fired? The decision that sealed Japan's fate. The war didn't start with a slow burn. The war didn't start with a thunderclap. Pearl Harbor. On paper, it was a masterpiece of military execution. It was swift, it was surgically precise, it was designed to be a psychological shockwave that would paralyze the world. If you look only at the smoke rising from Battleship Row, it looks like a definitive Japanese victory. But if you look beneath the surface, you see the outlines of a fatal gamble. The tragedy of the Japanese strategy was that they had a plan for the attack, but they had no plan for the aftermath. They had no answer for the most terrifying question of all: what happens when the giant wakes up? You see, for a strike like this to actually work, it had to be a kill shot. It had to decapitate the enemy's ability to punch back. Imagine if the cards had fallen differently. What if the Japanese bombers had caught the American aircraft carriers at the docks? The backbone of the US Pacific power would have been snapped in half. What if they had leveled the massive fuel farms and the repair shops? The US Navy would have been forced to retreat all the way back to the California coast, leaving the Pacific wide open. If that had happened, the history books might be written in a different language today. But the reality was a cold shower. By a stroke of pure blinding luck for the Americans, the aircraft carriers were out at sea, completely untouched. The logistics systems, the very veins and arteries of the military, were left almost entirely intact. Japan didn't kill America that morning. They delivered a painful, bloody wound to a nation with a nearly infinite capacity to heal and strike back. They didn't win the war, they simply burned the bridge behind them. In their attempt to knock the United States out of the fight, they committed the ultimate strategic sin. They didn't destroy the enemy. They only awakened a sleeping monster and filled it with a terrible resolve. The Industrial War. Japan never had a chance. 16 Act. In the modern age, war isn't just about the courage of soldiers or the brilliance of generals. It's not just about who shoots first or who aims better. Modern war is a battle of the factories. It is a war of production. And this is exactly where the Japanese dream began to shatter into a million pieces. The generals in Tokyo had a very narrow window of opportunity. They knew that if the war was a sprint, if it lasted only 6 months, Japan could stand as the victor. They could seize the resources, fortify the islands, and force a handshake. But if the war became a marathon, if it dragged on for 2 or 3 years, then the outcome was no longer a question. It was a mathematical certainty of defeat. On one side of the Pacific, you had the American engine. Once they shifted their gears, the scale was terrifying. We aren't talking about a few dozen replacements. The US began churning out thousands of aircraft every single month. They were launching new ships at a speed that defied Japanese imagination, sometimes building entire vessels in a matter of days. For every American plane shot down, 3 more were already rolling off the assembly line. On the other side, you had the Japanese struggle. As the months turned into years, your reality as a general becomes a nightmare. You are running out of the one thing that keeps an empire moving: oil. Your tanks are dry, your ships are anchored by empty bunkers. You are desperate for raw materials, for steel, for rubber, and the most painful part, you cannot replace what you lose. Every veteran pilot who falls, every carrier that sinks to the bottom of the ocean is a permanent scar. You don't have the factories to rebuild, and you don't have the fuel to train the next generation. The gap begins to widen until it becomes an abyss. You find yourself in a terrifying paradox. You are fighting a war against an enemy that gets stronger with every punch it takes. While the US military is expanding into an unstoppable juggernaut, your own forces are being hollowed out from within. One side is growing, evolving, and surging with power. The other side is bleeding out, fighting for every breath and slowly starving to death. It wasn't a lack of spirit that lost the war. It was the cold, hard reality that you cannot defeat a mountain of steel with nothing but willpower. Midway, the point of no return. 4:15 AM. Then came the moment where the tide didn't just turn, it surged back with a vengeance. The Battle of Midway. This was the crossroads. If you, as a Japanese general, could have won here, you might have locked down the Pacific for years. You could have dictated the terms. You could have kept the American wolf away from your door. But instead, the Pacific became a graveyard for the imperial dream. In a single, catastrophic afternoon, the heart of your naval power was ripped out. 4 fleet carriers, the pride of the empire, the very ships that struck Pearl Harbor, were sent to the bottom of the ocean. But you didn't just lose steel and wood. You lost something irreplaceable. Your elite pilots. These were the veterans, the men with thousands of flight hours who held the expertise of the entire Navy in their hands. When they went down, that knowledge vanished forever. This wasn't just a defeat, it was a total loss of momentum. The offensive was over. In an instant, the roles were reversed. Japan was no longer the hunter, you were now the prey. The initiative, the ability to choose where and when to strike, slipped through your fingers like sand. From this moment on, Japan is no longer the one making moves. You are only reacting, and that is the most terrifying position to be in when you are fighting the United States. Because once the American war machine finds its footing and starts its counteroffensive, it never stops. It's no longer a battle for territory, it's a slow, methodical grind. The Americans aren't just coming for the islands you took, they are coming for the heart of the empire itself. And they have the ships, the planes, and the cold, relentless fury to ensure that once they start moving forward, they will never, ever look back. Part 4. A fatal misjudgment. Deep within the command centers of Tokyo, there was a single, dangerous assumption that fueled every move you made. It was the foundation of your entire strategy. The belief that the American people would eventually get tired. You told yourself that Americans were soft, that they were divided. You believed that if you hit them hard enough, if you made the cost of war high enough in blood and treasure, they would lose their appetite for a fight across the ocean. You were betting everything on the hope that they would eventually sit down at the table and negotiate a peace that let you keep your empire. But you weren't looking at the reality, you were looking at a ghost. Because after Pearl Harbor, the America you thought you knew disappeared. Instead of breaking their spirit, you forged it into steel. The moment the first bomb dropped in Hawaii, the internal politics, the isolationism, and the hesitation vanished overnight. You didn't face a divided nation. You faced a united front of 130 million people, fueled by a level of collective rage that history had rarely seen. And while you were waiting for them to quit, they were only starting. Your plan required you to cripple them, but their heart was still beating at full strength. The American economy was untouched. There were no bombers over Washington, no tanks in the streets of New York. While Japanese cities began to feel the pinch of scarcity, American industry was just beginning to hit its stride. Their factories weren't just running, they were screaming at full capacity, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This is the ultimate strategic nightmare. You are a general standing on a track, hoping the locomotive coming toward you will run out of steam and decide to stop. But as you watch, the engine isn't slowing down. It's shifting into a higher gear. It's gaining momentum. It's getting faster, heavier, and more lethal with every passing second. You were banking on your enemy's exhaustion, but you were fighting an enemy that was just getting warmed up. By the time you realized that the Americans would never stop, that they would settle for nothing less than total, unconditional victory, the path back to peace had already been burned to the ground. Part 5. The Final Blow. The end of the empire. By the time the calendar turned to 1945, the empire was no longer a powerhouse. It was a hollow shell. Your planes were grounded for lack of fuel, your people were starving, and your cities were being turned into ash by conventional firebombing. The end was coming, but the leadership in Tokyo was still clinging to the hope of one last decisive battle on the home islands. And then, the world changed forever. In the span of just 3 days, the impossible became a horrifying reality. Hiroshima, then Nagasaki. This wasn't just another air raid. It wasn't just a bigger bomb or a more powerful explosion. This was something from a nightmare, a weapon that could erase a city from the map with a single flash of light. This was a message written in fire. The message wasn't just that the Americans were winning. It was that the war, as you understood it, was over. For years you had counted on the spirit of your soldiers to hold the line against American steel. But how do you fight the power of the sun? How do you ask your men to charge against an enemy that can destroy you without ever setting foot on your soil? The realization was cold and absolute. This was no longer a fight for territory or honor. If you didn't surrender, and surrender immediately, the question wasn't whether Japan would lose the war. The question was whether Japan would continue to exist at all. The path you chose in 1941, the gamble you took against the American giant, had led you to the ultimate dead end. The choice was no longer between victory and defeat. It was between surrender and total annihilation. The sun was setting on the empire, and for the first time in thousands of years, the Japanese generals had to face a reality where there was no move left to make. The monster had not only awakened, it had become the bringer of the end of days. Part 6. The final ledger, a predetermined fate. When you step back and look at the scorched earth and the sunken fleets, you realize a haunting truth. Japan didn't lose this war because of a single tactical error or one unlucky day at sea. The defeat wasn't a moment, it was a mathematical certainty. From the very second that first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor, the clock started ticking toward an inevitable conclusion. Looking back at the ruins of 1945, the autopsy of the empire reveals 3 fatal wounds. First, you chose the wrong opponent. You drew a sword against a nation that was not only your superior in every measurable metric of power, but was also insulated by 2 vast oceans and fueled by an industrial engine that had no equal in human history. Second, You fought without a long-term plan. You had a plan for the first day, the first week, and maybe the first 6 months. But you had no plan for the first year, the second, or the third. You gambled your entire national existence on the hope that your enemy would simply give up, without ever considering what you would do if they didn't. And finally, you entered a war of attrition that you could never survive. You walked into a meat grinder, thinking your spirit would protect you, only to find that machines don't care about spirit. You fought a war where every loss you suffered was permanent, while every loss your enemy suffered only made them faster, leaner, and more dangerous. The math of 1941 was cruel. If Japan had won a lightning victory, if the US had sued for peace in the first 100 days, history might be written in a different language today. But you didn't win fast. And the moment the war turned from a sprint into a marathon, the finish line vanished for Japan. The tragedy of the Japanese general in 1941 is the realization that despite the courage of your soldiers and the precision of your strikes, the outcome wasn't decided in 1945. It was decided the moment you signed the order. In the end, Japan didn't just lose the war. They ignited a fire that they were never, ever equipped to put out. History isn't just a collection of dates, names, and dusty maps. It is a series of decisions. Tiny moments, pens moving across paper, and the heavy breaths of men in dark rooms. Decisions that had the power to change everything we know about the world today. We look back not just to see where we've been, but to understand the high-stakes gambles that forged our reality. If you found this perspective on the impossible choices of the past intriguing, then don't let the journey end here. Hit that follow button and stay with us as we peel back the layers of the past, uncovering the hidden truths and the untold stories of history that rarely make it into the textbooks. The past is deeper than you think. Let's explore it together.